My name is Cassie Barrett. I help operate Carolina Memorial Sanctuary. We're a conservation burial ground just outside of Asheville in North Carolina. And I'm very excited to be with you all because you're my peers and we're in the same world and it's really awesome. I am covering a lot of information today. This is very detailed. And like David said, we will be sharing the slides and I'm going to do it so that you can also have my speaker notes because there's a lot of detail that's not going to be captured in the bullets. So I will begin. So body burials. We're going to start with interment, green burial interment methods for body burials. And of course, the very beginning, we're going to start digging a grave. So depth. Most of you probably already know this, but for most natural burial grounds, conservation burial grounds, etc., it's most common to dig graves between 3 to 4 feet. Little side note, I use the term cemetery in, either burial ground or cemetery, but I use the term cemetery a lot. So just know that it all means the same thing when I say that. So with regards to the 3 or 4 feet depth, it's not necessary to go deeper than that. A big reason why this movement exists and why people are attracted to this is that their body, as it decomposes, is providing nutrients to plant life. So if we go too deep, we're actually getting too far away from the root system. Another thing has to do with this idea. For people who are new to the idea of green burial, a very common fear is, won't an animal dig up my body? So once 18 to 24 inches of earth is placed above the body, that creates what's known as a smell barrier. Once there's that amount of earth above the body, an animal can no longer smell the body. So in the state of North Carolina, for example, we're required to have at least 18 inches. So when you consider that 3 to 4 foot depth plus the resulting mound, you're well over the smell barrier. In terms of dimensions, a kind of straightforward dimension would be 7 feet long, 3 feet wide. That will accommodate most average size caskets and coffins. That being said, anytime you know there's going to be a casket or coffin, you'll definitely want to get the dimensions and give that to whomever is digging the grave. With regards to a person who is in a shroud, the grave can then be dug to size. You can find out how tall the person is and dig the grave accordingly. For tools, the tools that you'll want to have handy are tarps, very critical, having the tarps to put all the earth on. A grave template, you can make this yourself out of wood. It's basically just already has those dimensions laid out. You can set that on the ground. It makes digging the grave easier to have that template. You'll of course obviously want a shovel or a spade. A spade especially is incredibly helpful. A mattock or a pick. If you're not familiar with a mattock, it looks very similar to a pickaxe, except the axe is shaped like this, and it's more of like a short shovel shape, which when you're working with clay or dense soil, it's really good at breaking up the earth. A rock bar. Some of you have land with no rocks, some of you have land with rocks. We have a mixture of both, and we have one area in particular that's incredibly rocky. A rock bar is very, very heavy, and it helps to break up the rock. An edging tool is just this flat shaped tool that really helps to create nice, clean walls. And then you're going to want some hand pruners or loppers or a small saw to cut through roots, because you will get to roots. That being said, be very mindful of how close you are to trees, because of course you don't want to kill that tree. And then for those of you that might have volunteers helping to dig the grave, especially if they're a little bit older, you may want to have a small ladder to help get in and out of the grave for safety reasons. And then let's see. So in terms of the methods, a lot of cemeteries, of course, do this by hand. And one way to do it would be separating the piles as you go. You would use all of those tools that I just mentioned. So separating the piles works like this. The topsoil would go in its own pile. Then you would create a second pile, which is sort of like the next 6 to 12 inches of earth. And then the third pile, of course, the largest pile would be the remaining part of the grave. We do that so that when we close the grave, the earth can go back in the same layer that it was originally in. So you would first, of course, put that largest pile in first, the second pile, and ending with the topsoil. That's incredibly important because the topsoil, as I'm sure a lot of you know, is where very beneficial microorganisms live. The root mass, the seed bank, and having that back on top will help to reestablish the plant life. And even in the green burial movement, there are cemeteries that use backhoes. If you're using a backhoe, I would just recommend still getting that topsoil. You could either do that manually before the backhoe comes, or you can teach them how to do it, but you're really gonna want that topsoil to be separate so it can go back on top. Once you've dug the grave completely, one of the things you're gonna wanna do is add vegetation. So this doesn't usually happen the day you dig the grave. This usually happens on the day of the burial because, of course, once you cut vegetation, it starts to die. You don't want a bunch of wilted things in the grave. But what we're doing is a couple of things. One is aesthetics, softening the appearance of the grave. If you imagine a grave with a bare bottom, it has a cold feeling, and it's not necessarily feel good for the guests and for the family to place their loved one in a bare bottom grave. So using pine straw, pine boughs, if it's spring and summer, you can get any sort of vegetation that's growing and line the bottom of the grave with that. And it really makes it so much more beautiful and soft. Another reason why vegetation is important is it, especially with shrouds, it helps to create air pockets. As you probably know, in terms of decomposition, oxygen is one of the most crucial elements. So when you're in a shroud, there's no casket or coffin around you, meaning the earth is directly coming in contact with the body. So having that vegetation can also be helpful for creating air pockets, which will help to keep some oxygen inside of the grave. The last bullet point here, beware of water, adipocere. So as I was saying, oxygen is incredibly important for decomposition. What you want to avoid is an anaerobic environment, an environment that does not have oxygen. So when you have a very watery grave, you end up with an anaerobic environment. And what that can do is produce a chemical reaction, I guess you can call it, called adipocere. This is when the fat cells of the body, they release a waxy substance which actually coats the body and it prevents it from decomposing. So what this means in practical terms, on the day of the dig, especially when you're getting towards the bottom of the grave, put a tent up, check for the weather. It also means that on the day of the burial, if you're expecting really heavy rain, make sure that that earth is protected either with a tarp, maybe having a tent up over the grave itself. I definitely recommend that. That being said, there's been times where maybe the grave fills up with water. It's happened almost to everybody I know. It's just one of those things that sometimes you cannot avoid, especially depending on where you are in the region. You might have seasons where there's just a higher water table. So you'll want to have a water pump, and most of us don't have access to electricity in the middle of our burial grounds. So you'll want to also have a generator. And just know that if water gets in the grave, it gets in the grave. It's not the end of the world, you just have to deal with it. So you can see in the upper left, here are some of those tools I was telling you about. You can see the mattock there. To the right of it is the edging tool. Here's a picture of the 3 mounds that I was telling you about. So you can see actually the change in color. The one closest to us is the topsoil, and the one that's the biggest pile is that one at the very top. So the next thing we're going to talk about is transportation. Okay, the grave has been dug. It's the day of the burial. So the first part is the transportation to the cemetery. And one of the important things, of course, there is to know the laws, their transportation laws. They vary by state. Some states require a transit permit, period, regardless of whether you're traveling in or beyond state lines. Other states only require a transit permit if you're crossing another state to get to your state. The transit permit can be obtained by a funeral director or one of their designated agents, which they usually get from the county clerk or the registrar's office. For home funerals, again, the laws there are gonna vary by state. When it's the family that may or may not be allowed to transport their loved one. And another little side note here, I use the term family, but we all know that when it comes to our loved ones, they may not actually be our family. They may be our friends or our chosen family. So just know that when I use that term, I'm applying it to anyone who might be at a burial, any of the guests. So when it's a family who's doing the transit, you'll just want to make sure that you're informing them of the laws. For example, if they need to get a transit permit, and things such as in North Carolina, families actually can transport their loved ones. They don't need a permit, but the body needs to be in an enclosed vehicle. So for example, you could not have a shrouded person in the back of a pickup truck unless that had a camper on it. Then of course, in terms of that transportation, that's going to happen via the funeral home or the family. And funeral homes, they all work kind of differently. Some funeral directors actually by law need to be present up until the point where the person has been lowered and earth has been started to be added to the grave. Actually, in our state, in North Carolina, that is the law, but we were able to work with the Cemetery Commission, and we now have a way where the funeral home, with the approval of the family, can release the deceased to us at the parking lot. And that's how we do it. We take over once the funeral home gets there. And some funeral homes may contract with a driving service, so that might be who is transporting the deceased to your cemetery. And then of course, in the case of a home funeral, when the family's doing it, all the ways I already mentioned. And in fact, White Eagle, the conservation burial ground in Washington, they had a family even rent a U-Haul to drive their loved one from Colorado. But again, just make sure that you're guiding the family so that they follow those laws. Wait, let me make sure. I feel like, sorry, I saw the pictures and I realized I passed 2 of the things. So then once, of course, the person is brought to the cemetery, the next thing is going to be putting them on a burial cart, because obviously you need to get them to the gravesite. So of course there's like wheeled hand-drawn carts, like the Amish carts, which are really beautiful, but that does not work for all the terrains. And then there's a trailer, which if you're like Carolina Memorial Sanctuary, that gets hooked to the back of a golf cart. As you probably know, one of the most important things, in my opinion, of the natural burial movement is empowering families to be hands-on. So even at this point, the family can be involved. They can help take their loved one on the back of the vehicle and place them on that trailer or on that cart. They don't have to be incredibly strong. As long as there's 4 to 6 people, that weight is distributed and it's totally possible. And then once the person is placed on the cart or the trailer, then of course it's getting to the site. So you can use the trailer or the cart, of course, to get the person to the site. Some people want to be pallbearers. They want to carry their loved one there. If they want to do that, of course, you're going to want to think about where the grave location is, and is that work with that certain terrain. It might not actually, there might be too steep of an incline or a decline. If they're shrouded, of course, they're much lighter and that's more feasible. And in that case, one of the things we use is, if you've seen those hand woven caskets, they actually make a hand woven carrier, which is quite beautiful. It's just nice, honestly, in terms of aesthetics for the whole ceremony, but it's also nice for carrying. Another thing that you can use is what's known as a mega mover. It's a material that the EMTs use, and it has handles, and that also works really well for a shroud. And one of the important things to do is talk to the family in advance of the burial to find out what their preference is, because some families don't want to be involved in the transportation. So when we talk to a family, we ask them, do they want to do a procession in which we're using the trailer and all kind of walking together, or would they like their loved one already at the gravesite? So you're going to want to ask them that, of course, so we can honor their wishes. Now I can show you the pictures. So you can see here is a picture of one of those hand-drawn carts. And in both of these pictures, they're using the mega mover I was telling you about. And then these folks are carrying a cardboard coffin. So graveside placement of deceased. Okay, so we're now at the gravesite. So of course, one place you can place the deceased is beside the grave. This can be really nice for shrouds. For families that want to put things in the casket or coffin, it is easier for them to get access to it if it's on the side of the grave versus on top of the grave. Every cemetery does it differently, even in terms of the order of operations, meaning some cemeteries like us, we place the deceased either beside or on top of the grave, and then we do the service. We don't do the lowering until after the service. Whereas White Eagle, for example, they do the opposite. They get to the grave site, and if the family wants to put anything into the casket or coffin, they'll do that, of course, first. And then they'll lower the casket or coffin into the grave, and then they'll do the service. There's no right or wrong way. It's just everyone kind of has their own style. The other option, of course, is to place the deceased on top of the grave. When you do that, there are boards, usually 2 or 3 boards that are going perpendicular to the grave. That's especially good for caskets and coffins because they're heavier, they're a little more cumbersome, they're a little harder to move, and so it makes the lowering process easier. When you use boards, often what you're doing is you're putting rope or straps on top of the boards, of course, before the casket or coffin is laid on top of that, so that you have something to lift it with. And then this is another opportunity for guests to be hands-on. Some cemeteries I know, even though the casket or coffin might have a handle, they'll actually use straps or rope to loop through the handle to kind of give people a little bit more leverage and a little bit more stability. Or you're actually guiding the family by holding the handles, over the boards. The thing here, of course, is just providing guidance and empowering people to do it. A critical thing, you can see this last bullet point, is thinking ahead. This is so important. Before the burial, before the family gets there, you're going to want to think through the route the entire way, the route from the parking lot, from the trail to the grave site, because every grave site is different. Its proximity to the path and the pathway to the grave is different. Sometimes there might be a tree that you have to look out for, or a stump that you have to look out for. You're really wanting to make sure that everybody is safe, and you want to look ahead of what people need to be mindful of. Another thing is the direction of the head. Where is their head? Where are their feet? That's going to affect, when you take the person off the cart or trailer, how you turn them. So you want to think all of that ahead. And definitely I recommend at least having one of your staff as part of the people that are carrying, so that they can just help provide guidance through that process. And if it's a particularly heavy casket or coffin, or you're on a really steep incline, you might even need one of your staff to get inside of the grave to help guide the casket or coffin. We had to do this once, and it was actually super, super helpful. It's a place where people's backs can really get hurt if we're not being mindful of what we're doing. Here you can see a photo of a man who's actually, as you can see, he's exposed. And even though that seems, well, it is atypical, it's always the families who are guiding this process, not us. And you can see here a picture of a casket on top of the boards here. So that gives you, and in this case, this was a very heavy casket, and that's why we have 4 boards, but we usually, this is at my cemetery, we usually have 3. So now we're going to move on to the lowering process. So starting with caskets and coffins. So again, as I already mentioned, it does work best when the casket or coffin is placed on the boards. So even if you start with the casket or coffin beside the grave, I do recommend placing the casket and coffin on top of those boards before you start the lowering process. For the lowering, you're going to need, of course, ropes or straps. If you're going to do ropes or straps on top of the boards, 12 feet is a good length. You can use a natural rope like sisal, which is awesome because it's beautiful and you can just leave it in the grave and not have to worry about taking it out. Or you might use straps made out of nylon or some other material that you then have to be thoughtful of how to remove that. And as I already mentioned, some cemeteries place rope or straps through the handles. So that's another way you can use ropes or straps. And so then, of course, the actual lowering process. This is another piece that was wonderful to have people participate in. And in my experience, almost families always want to be part of this. But this is a thing for folks that I think actually makes them the most nervous, because no one wants to drop a body. And so really providing guidance and talking them through it and going really slowly helps, so people know what to mentally prepare. So what we'll do, for example, is have 2 or 3 people on each side. And what I do before I even begin is I tell them exactly what we're going to do before we even do it, so that they know, again, what to expect. The first step, of course, is that everybody lifts together. Then staff, it's best to have a staff do this as the casket is hovering. The boards are removed, and then in unison and very slowly, the person, the casket, the coffin is lowered slowly into the grave. Once it has reached the bottom, if it's natural rope, they can just be let go. If you're using straps that you intend to reuse, it's going to require that you put logs or thick branches at the bottom of the grave, because you need to lift the casket or coffin. Obviously, if there was no lift, the coffin or casket would be directly on the straps and it would be very hard to remove them. So if we just put 3 logs, for example, also perpendicular to the length of the grave, then it's easier to move those straps out. And then, of course, if you're doing the method where the straps or ropes are through the handles, you simply remove them. So now we're going to talk about lowering a person who is shrouded. So a shrouding board, if you're not familiar, is a piece of material that is rigid, made out of either wood or plastic. For example, EMTs use a plastic, what they call body board, and this helps provide stability. Obviously, a shrouded person, you know, their head can move, their body can move, so having a rigid surface beneath is important. For a shrouding board, some of them are designed to be left in the grave. Others have handles where you can actually put the rope through the handles, and then that helps you lower it and then remove it. So what you would do, it's exactly like we talked about with lowering a casket or coffin. Exact same method. The straps can go under the shrouding board or through the handles. The difference would be if you're doing the technique where it's through the handles, once the person is completely lowered, you'd have one side, the 2 or 3 people on one side, release or pull out rather, thinking that it's looped through, pull out their ropes, and then the people on the opposite side would sort of slowly lift and kind of wedge that board out. Another method is using a sheet. This is actually what we do at Carolina Memorial Sanctuary. So the way we do it is that the sheet is placed under the shrouded person. In our case, we use that carrier. So there's the carrier, then the sheet, and then the shrouded person. We take the sheet, a queen size sheet, and we roll the edges all the way up to the body. This gives people something to grip, and it also gives them material to loosen so that they're not bending too far during the lowering process. So when it's time to do the lowering, what we do is 2 or 3 people get inside of the grave. I definitely recommend that one of those people is your staff, but you can invite guests to get inside the grave as well. Some people really love that. And then what happens is the body is placed to the very edge of the grave, and you instruct everyone, again, you're guiding them before they're actually doing it. Everyone lifts, we kind of walk until the body is centered in the grave, and then slowly unroll the edges of the sheet until the person reaches the ground. And then the people who are standing in the grave can do a method, if you've been involved in home funerals, where you're basically turning the body on the side, tucking the sheets, turning the body on the opposite side, and pulling out the sheets. The reason why we do this is the body feels held, and it's like there's people in the grave receiving the body. It just has a different feeling to it, and we really like the way that that feels. And if you do decide to try this method or use this method, I do recommend using an earth color sheet that is darker in color, so that the earth and the soil is not like making it so dirty looking. And then this idea of straps only, if anyone ever watched 6 Feet Under, there's a scene where they lower Lisa into the grave with just straps. Again, knowing that a shrouded body without any support is a little precarious, it's not the best method. I think you have to be really cautious with this. That being said, there are certain types of shrouds that have a shrouding board built into them. And of course, if there's that rigidity there, that stability, you can use straps only. But if there's not a shrouding board or anything like that, I would say maybe don't do it. And guest participation, we already talked about it. Same thing as before, you just guide them through it, go slowly. There's no rush to any of this. So here is a cardboard casket being lowered with straps. Here's the shrouding board. So you can see on one side that there's rope fed through the handle. This is from Prairie Creek. This picture is from Prairie Creek. And then here's actually our very first burial that we ever did. And this is the family, and we're using a sheet. So then, of course, whether you do the lowering first or after the service, we move on to closing the grave. So closing the grave. So, sorry, I have to look up close. Once somebody is lowered, before you add any soil, the first thing that people might want to do is add flowers or add some other sort of biomass, especially if they're in a shroud. So psychologically, it can be difficult for people to place earth directly on top of a body. So especially if it's spring or summer, if you can cut wildflowers and add that on top of the shrouded person first, or pine boughs, it just makes it a little bit easier for people. And then once, if the family has things they want to add to the grave, flowers, etc., then what's really nice is to start off with a ceremony of inviting anyone who's present to put 2 or 3 scoops of earth in first. The reason this is nice is it gives everyone an opportunity to participate, maybe folks who aren't physically able to fully close the grave, and it just has a nice ceremonial feel to it. And again, this is never pressure we're putting on people. This is an invitation. And so yeah, we just always just ask anyone who wants to come up, and so that happens first. And then after everybody who's wanted to add earth to the grave has done that, we then of course move on to fully closing the grave. And we're gonna, again, remember to guide people to start with that third pile, move on to the second, and end with the topsoil. And like the scoops, it's an invitation. No one's required to do this. One thing that some burial grounds do, I honestly think not most of them, we do this, and I think a few others do, is this process using burial sticks. So burial sticks are sticks that you've gathered on your property that have already started to decompose. And what you do is, once the earth has kind of reached almost the top of the grave, you stop the closing process. And this is another place where you can ask the guest if they want to participate. And the sticks are stuck into the earth, where the top of the stick is basically flush to the top of the grave. We kind of do that around the perimeter because it just seems weird to do it on top of a body. Like, it might feel weird to some people. The reason we do that is it helps to create air pockets, which is helpful for future roots. It helps to introduce additional microorganisms into the grave. And the other thought about this is that it helps to kind of funnel water down to the root system. And with the closing and guest participation, safety is the key here. So here's a place where you have to especially be mindful, and it's your responsibility to be taking care of everybody. It's very easy, in my experience, for people as they're closing a grave to go into a trance. So I kind of warn people before we even start. I tell them it's very easy to go into a trance, that they need to be mindful of their body, that they need to take breaks, that they need to hydrate themselves, and also to be attentive to other people who want to help, that someone stepping up to the grave is because they're wanting to participate. Do not put more shovels out than you want people using at one time. And often, depending on the layout of the earth and everything else, it's usually 2 shovels, maybe 3 max. If you put 4 shovels out there, they will all be used, and then you might end up in a situation that's not safe. So you want to instruct people as to where to stand, and again, empowering them if they want to do this. And even for folks who don't want to physically help or aren't able to, I always encourage families, even before they have the burial, to stay till the end to witness the closing, because this, if you've experienced it, is one of the most powerful, potentially healing aspects of the burial process. When you just lost somebody you love, to get to see that grave come to a full close actually really helps create closure. It's super powerful. So again, I'm never putting pressure on people, but I explain to them the potential benefits and let them make that choice themselves. And then as we're doing this, of course, your ceremony, we can be doing the whole time. Every burial is a tribute to that person. And so, like I already mentioned, flowers or other special objects, as long as they're biodegradable, can be placed in the grave, like love letters, drawings, from grandchildren, things like that. Music can be playing as you're closing the grave. That's really nice. People can be reading, poetry, scripture, etc. And then the last part is the completion of the grave. So what do we do once the grave has been fully closed? So some burial grounds will offer scattering of native seeds or memorial plantings. If you do this, definitely recommend that you're the one sourcing those things so you can ensure that they are in fact native. If being native is important to your cemetery, it's not for everybody. If you do offer this, it is incredibly meaningful for people, even if it's just scattering native seeds. It feels really great. But you'll want to be thoughtful of the habitat where you're introducing new species, the type of species, and be thoughtful of the time of year. It's not great to plant a tree in summer. So some memorial plantings actually happen after the burial versus the day of the burial. And obviously a great way for people to be hands-on. Whether you've used seeds or memorial planting or not, the next step you're going to want to do is you're going to want to put something on top of the grave, such as pine straw, to protect the soil. This prevents erosion from wind or rain. It helps keep the soil in place. If you have done some scattering of seeds, it protects the seeds from birds. And of course, if you're doing a planting, you might want to put some mulch down. And again, this is something you can guide the family through, you know, just have some pine straw handy, show them how to fluff it up, how to create a layer around the grave. And then the last piece after you've done the protecting the soil is the grave decoration. So it's really nice to encourage people to bring cut flowers. They don't have to be native flowers. There's not really a big risk there. The one exception to that, some florists might use seed pods, in which case you are going to want to be mindful. It might bring an exotic or invasive species that you don't want there. Other natural materials, depending on your guidelines of your cemetery, such as pine cones or other things found on site. Some allow that, others don't. At our cemetery, we do allow rocks as part of the decoration if they came, and only if they came out of the grave when we're digging the grave, and we'll help guide families how to place it around the perimeter. You don't want rocks or heavy objects, too many of them at least, on top of the grave, because again, oxygen being important for decomposition, we don't want to tamp down the earth. You will probably encounter families who are going to want to use non-natural objects like coins or stones or statues or glitter, etc. So you want to make sure that you're following your own guidelines and that you're providing them an alternative. You're saying, no, but here is what you can do. When it comes to a stone marker, it's really rare in my experience that you're going to have time to engrave a marker before a body burial. But we have had families who've already chosen their stone, and just for ceremony, they might want that placed. For cemeteries that use survey markers, they might actually have the family place that as part of the ceremony, or they might have them do it after. Again, this is just dependent on your particular cemetery and how you like to do things. So like, here's an example of an unengraved stone. This is one of my favorite parts, by the way, the decorating at the end, so nice. So here's an example of a grave that we have with the rocks around it. Okay, so now we're going to move on to burial of cremated remains. Starting with the science, you're also going to hear me use the terms cremains and cremated remains interchangeably. So the chemical composition, so cremated remains are considered inert, meaning they are no longer chemically active. They contain a lot of compounds, but the four main compounds found in cremains are phosphate, calcium, sulfate, and potassium. And they are by nature, cremated remains, salty and alkaline. So what does that mean? What is the effect on plant life? Salty and alkaline is not hospitable for plant life. Even though when we think of those compounds, they're compounds we would naturally find in fertilizer. But it's all about having it in the right quantities. For example, you wouldn't just straight up use fertilizer without soil. That would be way too much and it would kill the plant. The same thing can be true for cremated remains. Another thing I read in researching this is that the high pH also makes it so that those compounds are not bioaccessible by plants. And I just want to share a quick story, true story. The first time we did a scattering of cremated remains at Carolina Memorial Sanctuary, we did not know the science of cremains, and the plant was scorched and it died. And that's how we learned that, oh, this is not always a great thing. The last thing about cremated remains is that they don't break down easily. They will last a long, long time just as they are, well after the urn has, if you're using a biodegradable urn, well after it has broken down, and roots will avoid them. So the solution to this is amendment. There are 2 companies that have created amendments to help make cremated remains safer for plant life. It's just kind of like a soil amendment. It's something that's mixed with the cremains or added to the cremains in some way to make it safer, knowing that they're salty and alkaline. And that's the reason why. I mean, we know that they're salty and alkaline. I know from firsthand experience that it is actually harmful to plants. And so by diluting it, it makes it safer. There's 3 products that I know of that I want to mention. The first is Let Your Love Grow. That's created by a funeral director who hired an independent lab, and they worked on it for years to do a bunch of research. It's all organic materials. It can be used both for scattering cremated remains and a burial of cremated remains. The way it works is you get actually a big bag of amendment and sort of equal parts of amendment, cremains, and earth from the grave, that all of those 3 things are mixed together and they're placed directly inside of the grave. So there's no urn being used. One of the claims of this product is that over time, the compounds and cremains become bioaccessible. This product retails at $180 for the full size. They create sizes for different size pets, smaller humans and larger humans. So the 180 would kind of be your standard adult size set. The next product is Living Urn. It's very different than Let Your Love Grow. It is a biodegradable urn. And it comes with a very small bag of amendment and also a voucher that the person can use to purchase a tree that is intended to be a memorial plant. And it's a tree. It's 1.5 to 4 feet tall, this tree that they can order. So the way it works is you have the urn, you pour in the cremains, you pour in the amendment, so the amendment's not mixed, and then there's usually 4 to 6 inches of space in which earth is added on top, the lid is placed on the urn, and then that can be placed directly in the grave. It's very elegant, it's aesthetically pleasing. We actually use this for a pin oak. We don't do memorial plantings anymore. We found it to be very problematic. That's a whole nother webinar. But we did plant a pin oak using this product a number of years ago, and it's still alive. And this product retails at $129 plus the cost of the tree or the shrub. The last product that I wanted to mention, because a lot of us have heard about, is Bios Urn, which actually does not involve amendment. There's no amendment as part of this product. It operates and looks very similar to the Living Urn. It's a biodegradable urn. Instead of coming with a tree, it comes with a seed or seedling, and that seedling is planted on the upper part of the urn. Instead of using amendment, they use a growing medium, which is placed in the top of the urn, and that retails for $140. So which of these is the best? Frankly, the jury is out. The unfortunate thing about these products is that their research, at least now, is not in the public domain. So we have no way of knowing how they conducted their research. We can't look at their findings, and we're left trusting their claims. They all use amendment differently, or in the case of Bios Urn, don't use amendment at all. What we really need, and what I'm really hoping for, is that we get some independent research that's really looking at these products, and frankly, if we even need them, because there are cemeteries that don't use amendment at all. And hopefully, as a field, we're letting science guide our choices. So here's just a picture of unamended cremated remains. You can see there's like a clump. This is Let Your Love Grow, and then inside of that comes this big bag of amendment. To the left here is the Living Urn, which again includes amendment that gets added on top. And to the right, you see the Bios Urn. You can see here that the top section is separated from the cremated remains, and there's this medium where the seed goes. So digging a grave for cremated remains. So for cremated remains, it's nice to dig a circle versus a square. Just has a nice aesthetic to it. In terms of the diameter, you're going to go 12 to 18 inches across. For the depth, 18 to 24 inches deep. That's going to be based, of course, on the size of the urn. If the guests are using an urn, you might want it to be wider and deeper if, for example, you're using an amendment like Let Your Love Grow that has more volume, or if you're doing a burial with multiple cremated remains. The tools that you're going to use of course, are very similar to digging a grave for a body. You're going to want tarps, you're going to want a shovel and spade, you're going to want a mattock and a pick, and you're going to want to have hand pruners. And I still do recommend doing the soil separation. In this case, it might only be 2 piles. It might just be the topsoil and the remaining earth. Sometimes, depending on the soil structure that we're working with, it just might be 3 piles. You just kind of tell by looking at the soil composition. And then once you're done digging it, you're going to want to beautify it so it doesn't look just like a hole. So you can smooth the walls out. You can add vegetation or pine straw to the bottom. You can add some flower petals to the bottom, and it's really nice to actually decorate the circle. So the hole at the very top of the earth, you can kind of put vegetation all around that, petals all around that. It's really, really pretty. And again, that wouldn't be done until the day of the burial. So urn or no urn. If you're using an amendment, that's of course going to depend on the product. If you're using a living urn, it includes an urn. If you're using Let Your Love Grow, there's no urn used. Or if you are a conservation or a natural burial ground, if you're certified by the Green Burial Council, of course that urn's going to need to be biodegradable. There are a lot of options on the market, and you're just going to want to double check, especially if it is the family that's purchasing the urn. You're just going to want to make sure that it's green burial approved and that you're following the guidelines of the cemetery. We, for example, don't allow outside urns. We either use the living urn or Let Your Love Grow, and that dictates how we're going to do it. Some cemeteries don't use an urn at all. They, like I said, some don't even use amendment. They just place the cremated remains directly in the grave. Or another instance where you might not use an urn is if you're doing multiple cremated remains. So when we do a grave with 2 human cremains in one grave, we don't want to put 2 urns in there. It just feels better to mix all of that stuff together. So here's an example of the living urn, another picture of that. And then different biodegradable urns. So burying cremated remains. If, regardless of whether you're using an urn or no urn, you really recommend that you talk to the family and have them prepare the cremated remains ahead of time. And what I mean specifically is that cremated remains are often in a plastic bag with a zip tie. The zip tie is not necessarily easy to remove. If they've had those cremated remains for years, which a lot of families do, it might be in a sort of urn that's not easy to open. They might have screws closing it or glue. So in terms of that flow for the day of the burial, you're just going to want to have them, cut that zip tie, unscrew those screws in advance. And another thing to be mindful of is that not all families want to be hands-on in this. They don't want to be the ones handling the cremated remains. So again, you're going to want to talk to them in advance and just have them bring it the day of the burial, maybe get there a little bit earlier so that you and your staff can either put it in the urn or mix it with the amendment, or have them watch you mix it with the amendment. Point being is check with the family. If you're using an amendment, this is a great way for the family to participate. They can either, if they're using the living urn, be the ones to put the ashes in, put the amendment in, etc. If you're using Let Your Love Grow, you can help guide them through the mixing process. And then once those things are done, or even if you're using a biodegradable urn, obviously the family can do that too. Then the other thing that they can do is place it in the grave. Another time and another nice opportunity for them to be involved. And you're just going to want to be mindful of safety. So, having a kneeling pad can be really helpful. It's just obviously an even surface versus them leaning over. It's more comfortable. Their knees aren't going to be dirty. You can buy them. So gardening companies they make kneeling pads, or you can make your own. For example, Heartwood made their own with like a 2 foot by 2 foot piece of painted plywood with cushioning on top of that, and then a nice sort of faux leather on top of that. Because again, this can just be an emotional moment for people, and having that stability can be helpful. That being said, you also want to have a staff nearby just to help keep people balanced and or help them to stand once they are done placing the urn or the cremain mixture into the grave. So here's actually from my stepmom's burial. She was cremated. This is Let Your Love Grow. I'm mixing it here. And this is my brother placing it in the grave. So then the closing and completion. So it's very much like burying a body. It's exactly the same, actually. You know, the only kind of difference is that because you're dealing with a smaller amount of soil, instead of having everyone do 3 scoops, you might have them do 1 scoop. And it's always nice because, again, this can be an emotional experience for some people, or they might be a little bit nervous, to talk through what you're going to do in advance. So we're going to lower the urn. And then once we lower the urn, we're going to invite everyone to come around and put a scoop in. So again, that guidance is very, very helpful. I also find it's nice to use smaller shovels when closing a grave for cremated remains, because you don't have that much earth and it just helps to extend the time so it doesn't go by too quickly. But in general, once you've moved on to like fully closing the grave, it takes about 15 to 30 minutes. And you might just want to be thoughtful about things like handing the shovel to one of the immediate family members first. You can do that, or just invite whoever feels called to come up to do that. It can be a very organic process. And then again, because if you decide to separate the soil, you just want to make sure that that topsoil goes back on top. You still don't want to tamp down the soil, and it's nice to have a rake handy just so you can make a nice mound. So that's the closing part. Then for the completion, you can also do memorial plantings. That's how the living urn is designed to be used. But again, just going to be mindful of the season, whether or not, depending on your burial ground, whether or not you're using native plants, and being thoughtful of the habitat. You'll also want to protect the soil after closing a grave for cremated remains, using pine straw, something like that. So again, it helps prevent soil erosion, and also it's nice looking, and it makes it easier for the family to find it. And again, something that the guests can do. Grave decoration, same exact thing. You can use cut flowers if your cemetery allows it, other natural items. And again, it just depends on you and your guidelines. For example, conservation burial grounds, we have a little bit stricter guidelines we have to follow. The benefit of cremation, of course, is that the burial doesn't have to happen immediately, which means that some families will want and will have a stone engraved, and that can be a nice ceremonial piece of the burial as well. If you do have an engraved stone, I find it nice to actually place that after the pine straw, but before the flowers. And so you can have the family place that, and then that way the flowers can be resting on top of the stone, on top of the grave. It looks really, really nice. And so here's actually a picture from that burial I was telling you with the pin oak. So in this case, we did a memorial planting, and there's an engraved stone that was placed. So the last little piece with cremated remains is scattering. So the only product that I know about, the only amendment-based product that I know about for scattering is Let Your Love Grow. If you use this product, the way it works is it's actually mixed with the cremated remains. It needs to sit for a minimum of 4 months before it's safe to scatter. This is the only way we do it, based on that experience I was telling you of the tree dying. It only took that happening once to like never want to repeat that again. So we will take the cremated remains from the family, we will mix it with Let Your Love Grow and let it sit for 4 months, and then schedule the scattering. In terms of scattering locations, when we first started, we actually let people pick an area. And then after thinking about that more deeply, we realized that was problematic. One is inadvertently, you might end up doing a burial where someone's remains have been scattered, and that's not good. The other thing, quite frankly, is that scatterings, because they are way less labor intensive, they are not as expensive generally as a burial, especially a body burial. And so you're using that land and you're not making as much money. And that's something that we all have to be mindful of, because it sounds weird to talk about death, which is so sacred in business terms, but it's not. You know why? Because we have an enormous responsibility. These people are trusting us with their money to bury their loved one, and it'll be decades, decades, decades until all these burials take place. So being smart and thinking about this in a business way is critical. This is how we protect them and their investment. So what we've done, instead of using a location, is we actually now have the family pick a tree. This is really awesome because it gives them a physical landmark, and people love trees. So they have a specific place they can go that they know their loved ones' remains are scattered around this tree. The other thing it allows you to do is have a small engraved marker at the base of the tree. When we were doing a location, there was really no place to place a marker, so we didn't even allow that. And then when it comes to the scattering, by the way, lots of cemeteries don't even offer this. So this is just if your cemetery is considering it. It's a great, for the guest participation, one thing I especially like about scattering is that it doesn't really require your presence, thus giving the family the ability to be in privacy if they want. So I will ask families, would you like to do this by yourself? I can guide you through the process. They always say yes. Understandably, it's a very vulnerable experience to go through this. And so it's kind of nice to get to do that in privacy. So you just simply explain to them how it's done, and you can walk away and let them have their own private ceremony. So here's an example of a scattering tree, the cremains mixed with Let Your Love Grow, and you can see there's an engraved stone there at the base. And here's another. So getting to the heart of it, protecting the environment is amazing and necessary, and empowering families to do this themselves, in my opinion, is really like such a beautiful offering that we are giving to our communities. It's their loved one that has died. They get to do this themselves. They get to be hands-on. Children are encouraged to participate. They're the one closing the grave. It's their loved one. And for those of you, of course, who've already experienced this, we know how powerful it is. It's night and day compared to conventional burial. Families can be empowered to care for their own after death, to use your hands and body, to lay your own loved one to rest, to participate in this sacred act rather than simply observing it. It's everything. This is where true healing begins, healing families and the earth together. So that's the end of my presentation, but I do want to thank my humble colleagues. So I did not do this all on my own. Jody Bueller from White Eagle Memorial Preserve. All the people I'm going to mention, by the way, are conservation burial grounds that are also board members of the Conservation Burial Alliance. So she helped write this. Laura Starkey from Heartwood Preserve in Florida helped write this. David Ponoroff from Larkspur Conservation in Tennessee, he edited this and is obviously the person who's helped hosting today. So I definitely did not do this on my own, and just wanted to give a shout out to my colleagues who helped me a bunch. And so that is it. We're going to move on to the Q&A. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and then David's going to take over as the moderator.
Thanks, Cassie. Yeah, it's, even though we've been doing this work for years now, it's always so fascinating to be able to think and talk through and listen to other people doing the work, because of the different ways that we've kind of chosen and worked through some of these different things. So I know I've seen one question come through in the chat. So if you do have questions, please do send them through there so that we can start with them. And then we can open up for sort of even a group discussion a little bit after.
And David, at this point, do we want to start putting videos back on, or do you want to wait until after?
Sure, we can do that. Everybody should be able to restart their videos if they want to here now. And let me pull up my little Word document here. So Cassie, the first question was specifically about kind of understanding your seasonal water table, water levels, and adipose air, and understanding, when it comes to groundwater and, heavy rains after a burial, what are the things that you're thinking through?
Yeah, I actually think that so in North Carolina, the water tables where we are specifically in North Carolina, we don't encounter that. The only time we had a grave fill with water was a very, very rainy day. The family wanted some privacy. We had a tent up actually over the grave. The family wanted some privacy, so we walked away, and they didn't let me know that the grave was filling up with water. So I quickly got there and was like, oh crap, and just trying to fix it. But in Florida, I know that's more of an issue. And David, prior to working at Larkspur, worked at Prairie Creek. So David and Laura, I think you would be better equipped to answer that question.
Say, I'll start.
Sure, yeah. We're in Florida, and it's about 6 months of our year, it is very wet here. We have afternoon thunderstorms, and our groundwater, seasonal high groundwater table is very high and just below the surface at times. So we have regularly encountered rain, and well, rain for us in terms of the presentation is really, in terms of the service, is much more a situation of just holding off for thunder and lightning and convenience if it's heavy. But our concern is more about the groundwater that's in the grave when we open it. It doesn't matter if it's raining or not. So we use a pump. We have a Honda trash pump, and it works great to get the pump out. We also have a hand sump pump that John Christian at Larkspur turned me on to, a very simple method, which is good for cremation holes, openings as well. So we pull out all the water we can up until the body goes into or the family comes out into the, and when the body goes in the grave. And we have had some burials where there was still water in the bottom because it was coming down from the bottom of the grave. This is something that I worried about a lot at the beginning, and they've accepted it just as just part of the reality of Florida soils in half of the year. So I don't know if that
And
answers.
I would say with regard, no, I think that's a great response. And I would say at the end of the day, there's only so much we can control. You can only do the best that you can do. And with regards to adipocere, honestly, in my mind, it's more of a psychological thing, meaning this: if adipocere were to happen and this waxy substance was surrounding the body, yes, the body might not decompose, or it might take much longer to decompose. But really, at the end of the day, is that even the worst thing? Like I already heard me say, try to avoid it. Cover the grave when you're digging it if it's a rainy day. Have a tent up on the day of the burial if it's a rainy day. But if you're like Laura or Prairie Creek out in Florida, it's maybe just the reality that you have to work with.
It is, and we've found that if we talk to families about that, I've talked to other cemeterians of conventional cemeteries early on because I was worried about it at the beginning, and it's basically just kind of a reality for all cemeteries, even in non-rainy Florida, but that it's just, there is water in the ground, and we are in direct contact. We don't have, of course, sealed off caskets and vaults that other cemeteries are protecting from those elements, but this is definitely one of the big elements of Florida. So we just embrace it, and we, like with anything else that can freak people out initially, if we just respond and just say, yes, this is an issue. It's not an issue, but it's a thing. It exists. So, and this is how we handle it, and this is just part of the process. So sometimes when we're closing the grave, we can hear water splashing in the bottom of the grave because it started to seep down during the time of the service. And so we try to minimize the sound of splashing of the mud in the bottom of the grave during the closing. But it's kind of like with your kids, you exemplify not freaking out, and then they'll hopefully will follow in turn to understand that this is just part of it. So
Thanks, Laura. The next question was, how many days typically pass between death and when a full body burial occurs?
So at this point, I've done over 100 burials. That's both burial cremated remains and body burials. In my experience, it's usually 3 to 5 days after death that a burial occurs. But something that's really good to know is that even without embalming, most bodies, not all, can be good up to a few weeks. I've talked to a number of funeral directors about this because, of course, what we're doing is we're delaying decomposition by keeping the body cool. So it's in refrigeration, or if you're in a home funeral setting, you're using dry ice or Techni ice. So our personal experience is the longest that we've had a burial after death was 11 days, and it was totally fine. There wasn't like a strong odor or anything like that. But there are certain bodies that decompose more quickly. And so most people, of course, are using funeral homes. And if it's a situation where you think that might be the case, for example, people who have a lot of belly fat, because it's the the different bacteria in the gut that are assisting the decomposition process. If there's a lot of fat around the stomach, that insulates and it creates heat, and that can speed up decomposition. If there's been a lot of physical injury, we actually have a funeral director, John Cushion's here, who can talk to this more, but the point is that most often it's nothing you have to be worried about. But even in a case where decomposition is happening more quickly, you just prepare the family, you let them know. I've been in that situation that someone's recently received chemo. Chemo kills everything. Those people can be more likely to decompose more quickly. And then in just the most gentle way you can, you just mentally prepare them. And that might mean that you're not going to use a shroud. We've had burials where we were going to use a shroud, and then based on just the body and the state it was in, it just did not make sense. It wasn't going to be the best experience. And so we moved to using a casket or a coffin.
I think that's a really good answer, Cassie, especially thinking through how, families may want to think or kind of work through, what's used as a burial container for, shrouds versus caskets, depending on what the situation might be. I know that I've done burials that are, 3-4+ weeks, even after somebody has died. And with, modern refrigeration in a funeral home setting, it's really not an issue. I think I saw Jody, did you have anything else to add on that one?
Yeah, my sense is that if the family is doing a home funeral and using dry ice or Techna ice, that definitely is sort of a 3 to 5 day window is most comfortable for everyone. We had a burial in April of a woman who had died in the end of January, and it was important to her. She wanted to be buried when the wildflowers were blooming. So that her family worked with a funeral director who was able to keep her in shelter for a number of months. And then she was buried in a willow woven casket. Again, that would be probably not a shroud burial scenario, but in cases like that, it can be done. The delay can be, I think, a little bit harder for kind of just family grief processes. But at the same time, in that case, it really gave everyone the chance to work through some things, and that burial had a more creative tone to it. People had a little bit more time to really think through what they wanted the ceremony to be. So there's a case for making space and time also to let people kind of sink into it and think through.
The next question was if anybody has had issues caused by the settling of soil after a body burial, and how much settling is really to be expected.
I can answer that first because we all have, I'm sure, something that we can say to this based on our own individual experiences. I will notice that with caskets, that once the earth settles, you can sometimes see settling around the casket. So you'll actually see this rectangular shape, but that's not an issue. It's just an aesthetic thing. I've also noticed that if there's rain within the first 2 weeks of closing a grave, that the soil will actually settle much more quickly. There's something about the soil is still loose, so the impact of the rain will actually cause it to settle more quickly. And even on our site, which is only 11 acres, it depends also on the section and the type of soil. We have more clay in our soil. In Ramsey Creek, that has been around since '98. Their mound, all of their graves still have a mound, even if it's very subtle. And we assume it's because of that clay content. Whereas in Florida, they have very sandy soil, and it will actually go back down. The only issue I've had is when families place the rocks directly on the grave. And that only happened once because, again, the family wanted to do it in privacy, and we walked away, and they ended up putting a lot of rocks actually on the grave. So we now know that, of course, they can have privacy, but we just need to guide them, visually guide them. This is where you're going to place the rocks. That's the only time we've ever had an issue, in which case we had to take some of the mound, redistribute it, move those rocks, and just redistribute the earth a little bit, which is not ideal. I mean, you really don't want to mess with the earth if you can avoid it, but we had to, or we chose to. Did any of the others, Jody?
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. I suspect because we have we have pretty snowy winters and pretty hot summers. And so we do definitely notice where the weather can impact the rate of settling. Um, I kind of talk about going out each fall and checking on everybody and tucking them in for the winter and kind of assessing how all the grave mounds are doing, especially that during the first 2 to 4 years after a burial, just kind of paying closer attention to how the mounds are settling. And then going back out and checking on everybody in the spring and just kind of attending. And that doesn't ever feel like, uh, doesn't necessarily feel like it's drastic with the settling, but it is definitely something that we're attending to.
Yeah, I think the only other thing that I would add is that sort of educating families as you're working with them as to what to expect, right? That when you're doing a burial where the person is buried in a casket, particularly if it's a wood casket, it's going to take longer for that wood casket to break down. And so it's going to displace the earth for longer. And so the mound is going to remain higher for longer. Whereas with a shroud that's, not propping up that soil quite as much, you might see settling a little bit more quickly, but I wouldn't ever say that there's issues caused by the settling. It's just a natural phenomenon. And as long as you're taking all of the soil that was, taken out and digging the grave and putting it back exactly where it was, you're not going to end up with a hole sort of where the grave was or anything like that.
I actually thought about one issue. We have one section of our cemetery that is really, really rocky. And what we've chosen to do, because that rock is taking up so much volume, if we were not, we end up, what we do is after the person, the shrouded body or the casket is placed in the grave, before the closing, we'll actually put rocks back into the grave. Because I actually think that if we didn't do that, there would not be enough soil and we would have an issue where the earth actually went below the earth level. So, and we might even sometimes have so many rocks that we take them, put some back in the grave, keep some for decorating, and then take some and even actually completely move it away from the site because there's just so much rock.
The next question was if we had any comments about group memorial options rather than individual stone markers. I was going to say both for Prairie Creek and Larkspur, there were no kind of group markers or anything like that. Cassie, do you guys use anything like that?
The only thing that we do is we do couples markers. So if it's a couple, or it's two people, they don't have to be a couple. If it's two people that are side by side, we will allow for a larger stone marker that can have both of their names engraved on it. But no, we don't offer any sort of group memorialization. And by the way, anybody who operates a cemetery is welcome to chime in. None of us are experts here, and we really welcome anyone's input and experience.
Absolutely. The last question, and I'll sort of use that as an invitation for any more, is whether or not certificates of interment rights are provided to clients.
Certificates of interment rights. If I understand the question correctly, we do offer that, but just to be clear what that means for us, once somebody, so we do pre-need, so some cemeteries can only do at need. So at Carolina Memorial Sanctuary, people can purchase their spot in advance. Once the spot has been fully paid for, we do give them a certificate showing that the spot has been paid in full. It has their full name, it has their coordinates, because we track all of the grave locations using GPS. And again, that's only provided because we offer a payment plan. So in the case of our payment plan, they would receive that certificate after their spot or spots have been paid in full. From whomever asked that question, was that what you meant, or am I missing the question?
And let me say, I think, Jennifer, I'll find you here real quick so that you can unmute and speak to maybe a little bit more of what you were thinking of with that question. As soon as I find you.
Yeah, I will chime in here for a moment as well. We offer a certificate of interment rights, again, after people have paid in full. That's for people to put in their folders and kind of make it helpful for the people who are helping with the logistics. But that doesn't have any real legal weight. Well, I mean, it has a legal weight. It's an affirmation of a contract. But we use that also to help remind them whether or not they've paid in advance for what we call the open and close, or the burial fee, which isn't due until the time of burial with us, but can be paid ahead of time. So we're tracking that in our own internal systems, but that's also a helpful reminder for folks of like, you got your site and you got your certificate of interment rights, but there is still this piece of financial business that will remain, or we've paid for everything ahead of time and you're set.
Yeah, I think Larkspur is the same, that it's one of those extra tools that you can use and give to folks as a kind of confirmation of their contract when they're doing prepayment for pre-need burial. But for at-need families, it's not really helpful for getting them anything that they need.
Yeah.
So with that, don't know that we have any more specific questions, but I'll let everybody here unmute themselves and sort of chime in if you have any other questions that we want to kind of tackle together here as a group.
Yeah. And Holly Blue, just to your question, yes, we are going to make this recording available, and we'll send out the slide deck as well.
Any
You've
more
already said this. I was responding to a direct message for a second. Did you say we're gonna unmute it and allow people to ask any other questions they might have? I didn't hear.
Yep.
I'm sorry. I didn't
Everybody can unmute if they would like to. There's no way for me to hard unmute everybody, but if anybody would like to unmute themselves, they should be able to do so now. While we're doing that, sort of just share a little bit of a teaser that the next CBA webinar is going to be coming soon in the next few months, specifically about conservation easements. And we're working with conservation easements for conservation burial. And that for those of you who are already CBA members, you'll receive access just like you did for today's webinar. And for those of you who only got today's webinar, if you wanted to become a CBA member, all the CBA members get access to all the webinars that we do throughout the year.
Sure.
Hello.
Somebody.
Okay. I actually am using Jenny's laptop, but my name's Pam. So we have people that want to donate or have their body used for science at some point, and then there will probably be embalming happening at some point. And I'm just curious about the concern about formaldehyde, and if that is a complete no-go for a green burial.
If they're
with embalming.
Yeah, if they're certified by the Green Burial Council, then you're not allowed to have an embalmed body. Most science programs actually cremate the body. Not all of them do, but most of them, after they've used the body for science, the body will be cremated, and then the cremated remains will be returned to the family. Another thing is, I have a lot of people who are like, oh, I'm going to donate my body to science. It's not that easy, and it's helpful for them to have a plan B. Only about 60% of people who apply for these programs actually have their bodies used for science. So some people see it as like I don't have to think about it. They're going to use my body. And it's just good to educate people around that to think of a plan B in the case if their body's not accepted.
And then just a follow up, there are some green embalming, I don't know, like essential oils. I'm not sure what they are, but
yeah, there's a green.
Have you used those?
Sorry. There's
Have
a
you ever
Green
used
Burial
those?
Council. Yeah, there's a Green Burial Council approved embalming fluid. It's technically approved by the Green Burial Council. We personally haven't had a family or a funeral home request to use that. So we haven't really made decision definitively around that. I feel like if we were, like, we need to personally research the ingredients. What about other folks? Do you all have experience, other cemeteries using that product, or know where you stand on it, whether you do or don't allow that?
I guess for us, we have not yet had anyone request to use that at Heartwood Preserve, or we've had, funeral directors asking about the product, that have they bought the product, but haven't had any takers for it yet. And I guess our sort of, at least, or my opinion on that is it's not an official stance, other than our official stance is we don't take embalmed bodies. But generally, personally, I feel that the process of embalming is something that is in most cases, not all cases, but in most cases is not a necessary process. And for those most cases of it being not necessary, it's just a very, personally a violent action on the body that is a service that's expensive and just not necessary. But that's kind of, it's not even, so it's beyond just the formaldehyde versus essential oils.
Yeah.
It's more about the whole process of why are we embalming the body. That said, I understand that there are certain scenarios in which it's perhaps really, I guess, needed or something. So that's
Well, and there have been times when, people are across state lines and they say they won't transport a body without having it been embalmed. Is there an argument to that?
I have heard, yeah.
I was going to say, my recollection is that there are only 4 states that require embalming when crossing state lines. I can't recall them off the top of my head. I know that Alabama previously was one of them, although there's some question as to whether that law is even still on the books. I think what it speaks to for me personally is, it seems like one of those categories or topics where funeral directors sometimes, or cemetery operators sometimes, have a belief of something that is law that really may only just be funeral home policy or cemetery policy, right? Like requiring embalming for a viewing. It's not a law, it may just be that organization's policy. And so it may just be require a little bit more digging. I'd encourage you to, maybe even look to the National Home Funeral Alliance. I know that they have sort of collected on their website more specifically, what may be required in individual states, particularly with embalming. And so they may have some good resources there for you.
I want to get this question.
Go ahead, Laura.
I was just going to say one more real quick thing. This might be anecdotal, but I've spoken on this with one of our funeral directors that we work very closely with on many burials, who is does mostly Jewish burials. And I asked him about that, and he said, I take unembalmed bodies across state lines all the time. I've even flown them to Israel. So, and maybe it has to be in the guise of it's a religious exemption or something. I don't know about that, but I just know that he has said he has had no problems, and he regularly, being in Florida, we have a lot of people from other parts of the world, of the country. So he's done that. So that's all I know about that.
Embalming is not required for flying. You can, the funeral homes can coordinate that with each other to transport the person from one state to another. It's placed in a special container specifically made for bodies. It's packed on ice. And so we get that question all the time. What if I'm on vacation and I live in North Carolina, but I die in, Phoenix? They can still have a green burial. Their body does not have to be embalmed. The funeral home that they have hopefully already contracted with would be in coordination with the funeral home in Phoenix. The family doesn't even have to be the one coordinating that. There's obviously an additional cost for that other funeral home for the cost of the ticket, et cetera. So anyway, just wanted to add that in because I know that's a question that gets asked a lot.
And I'll speak to the international travel here for a second, and then I saw Penny, you had a question. At Larkspur, we actually had back a couple years ago now, a person who is a Nashville native, but had gone to Vienna, Austria, to participate in an experimental treatment program, and he died there, and we were able to help his family coordinate with a funeral home here in Nashville, the embassy in Vienna, and a funeral home there to be able to fly his body back and have a natural burial without embalming. I think a lot of this, particularly in airfare and transporting a body, comes down to cost and what the family is willing to be able to pay to be able to make sure that that happens. But as far as embalming being a requirement for that, absolutely not the case, even for international travel. And then Penny, I know that you had a question.
Well, it's actually, the topic has moved on. So, but what I just wanted to say, I'm coming from Canada, and one of the beautiful things, one of our natural burials, it's not conservation. Well, one is conservation. They actually use the stones that are unearthed as markers. So they allow the family to choose one of the stones that have been unearthed. And then our green burial park actually has a large stone every so often. And then they have, so the families can actually see that their loved one is kind of in the next path. So as a community marker, and it works really well. So
That's
I just
cool.
wanted to share that.
Are they also engraved?
Yeah, so the large stone for community honoring is engraved. The ones in Salt Spring, it's called Salt Spring Natural Cemetery. They actually use the stones out of the ground, and then they have a local person who comes to the site and etches them for the family and puts the name and whatever they would like on it.
That's cool.
Yeah, really beautiful, and a beautiful community process, that it's somebody local who just arrives, and the stone is never taken away from the land and brought back.
Oh, that's really sweet.
Yeah.
Before we move on, I just want to, it's 4:30. Do we want to shut it down, or do we just want to keep taking questions as long as there's questions? David, Jody, any strong feelings?
Let me say, I know that I can stick around at least for another few questions.
Well, there's one that Tyler Keniston typed in about 10 minutes ago, so I want to make sure that doesn't get skipped. The question is, what sorts of average densities are most finding they end up at? 300 per acre max, question mark. So the Green Burial Council, of course, you're not legally required to be certified by the Green Burial Council, but a number of us are. And the density is actually part of the guidelines that you have to follow. So if you're a conservation burial ground, the maximum density is 300, in general, 300 bodies per acre. The reason why I say in general is if there's a protected habitat, you might be able to take that number and expand it to a different acre if there's like protected species that you're not able to bury at. For natural burial grounds, it's 500 bodies per acre. And I don't know if there is a maximum for hybrid cemeteries. So that's not exactly answering your question, but the point is like us and a lot of people on here are certified. And so we can't technically, if we want to, keep our certification and follow those guidelines, we can't go beyond 300. And that's specifically for body burials, because that doesn't include conservation or burial cremated remains, I don't think. Right, guys? Isn't that only for body burials? Jody's saying yes. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's what I remember as well. And I think part of what I saw in your question, Tyler, was what is the actual density that you're ending up at? And I think now, having been at 2 different conservation burial grounds that are structured a little bit differently, I'm seeing a lot of different things. Right, where Prairie Creek is based on a grid system where there's sort of there's a clearly defined plot size and organization. The density is really easily known. There's some variability in the ecosystem, right? Because the meadow prairie sections allow for, more dense burials than a wooded area where you're having to deal with trees that may not line up exactly with the grid system that exists. Whereas in Tennessee, where I am now, we don't necessarily have the smooth, flat land that Florida is known for. We have serious topography and hills and valleys, and really serious topographical changes that happen very quickly, in addition to trees. And so kind of knowing and understanding your land itself, that is going to change your density in a given acre. And so that's going to be, I think, part of your thought process as you work through, well, how many spaces can we, or how many barriers can we have in a given area, and adjusting.
And for us at Carolina Memorial Sanctuary, we don't use a grid system. So in order to kind of keep that 300 bodies, you know, we basically leave between 5 to 10 feet between unaffiliated graves. So obviously a family grave, they would side by side, but any, you know, nearby grave needs to be at least 5 feet away. And Jeff, he answered some of the questions. There is no maximum for hybrid burial grounds. It does only include body burials, not burial cremated remains. And that for many of those that have like a conservation burial ground that might have a conservation easement placed on the property, sometimes the conservation easement will dictate what the maximum density is per acre. Any other?
I'll chime in just a minute. We work also with a grid system, and our grave sites are 20 feet by 20 feet. But one of the very first things that I say to people who I'm bringing out for a tour is that we've laid a grid over the forest to allow us to track where you are and give you a site number and put it in a folder and all of those things. But what we're working with is the forest. We're working with that landscape. And so in any given 20 by 20 section, there may be a cluster of oak trees, and we're not going to bury anybody there. So it's really just letting the land lead us and be attentive to where a burial would like negatively impact tree roots versus you know, be very well situated. And so I have gotten to the point where I am very hesitant to even say how many sites we have available for burial, because it's such a landscape based priority, I guess.
Teresa, I think you were about to ask a question.
Sure. No, I just wanted to mention something that we just heard when we had our open house. We had, this is the Baldwin Hill Conservation Cemetery, and we're up in Fayette, Maine, and we're opening July 1st. So I wanted to mention some of the funeral directors were there, and the topic of donating a body to science came up, and they wanted to remind us that when you donate your body to science, you are embalmed, and the bodies are used for quite a long period of time during the scientific research. And after the institution is finished with that research, then the person is cremated, but the embalming fluids that were used are dissipated, obviously, as part of the cremation process. So we were comfortable with that overview. That, you know, there could be somebody who donated their body to science, they were embalmed, but then they were cremated, but the remains of that, the embalming fluids, wouldn't be in the burial ground.
Thanks for bringing that up. We've talked about that before with the CBA, and that, yes, that's a really helpful point. Any other questions? Anyone just want to pop in if they do?
I'm tempted to say something about the burial density question, just to say, I think one of the things that we struggle, or that I struggle with, or our group struggles with on that decision in the long run, is not only what's, you know, looking at the impacts of our burials on a given acre or given piece of our land or anyone's land during this era, but thinking of a cemetery as a forever use of this land. So what's going to be the impact of those burials from this decade, 6, 7, 8, 9 decades from now? You know, so when we're looking at that, as you know, the land's going to be in a totally different era of its, perhaps depending on what your ecosystem is, what your land is like. So that's one of the things that I think about is, okay, if we're limiting ourselves to, let's say, 200 bodies per acre forever and ever, is it important 80, 50 years from now, if all of those burials occurred in the first 20 years, for example, maybe, maybe not. So anyway, that's just a question that I continue to think about. And I think a lot of us are kind of questioning or just kind of running it around. And so I welcome any discussions into the future about that with people.
So it feels like we're done. Just want to thank everybody for being here. It's just nice to, again, feel community around something that I know is so meaningful to all of us. David already said it, but you will get a recording of this webinar. We'll work on getting the slides. I'm going to try to see if I can get my presenter notes as part of the slides. I'm hoping that's possible. And we have for members, we have a CBA forum where you can ask questions, especially as you newbies. Even us who've been around, there's always questions. There's so much involved in this. So Jody, is the forum is specifically for members, right? So for those of you who are members, or if you're considering it, that's one of the benefits, is that we have this forum where you can pose a question, and the community, not just us, not just the CBA, but all of the members of the CBA can just participate in that and support each other and help us get answers to questions. I think that's it. Anything else, David, before we end?
No, I think that's it. Thanks very much, y'all. We'll see you soon.